Hi, I'm Christy Merriman. Welcome to Free Advice's Look at Study Skills. This is edition 4, and today we're looking at how to read textbooks effectively. Our special guest is Dr. Ruth Loeffler, who is a reading specialist. Her doctorate is in reading, and she is a teacher at Norman High School. She's in charge of our Gifted and Talented program. She teaches advanced English, Western civilization, and she is very active in the Arts and Humanities Council of Norman, along with so many other organizations. And we're very pleased to have you with us, Ruth. We're talking about reading. I know it's very common for students to be surprised when they don't do well in class. And when they come to me, we'll sit down and we'll be talking, and I'll say, well, do you read the textbook? And they'll say, well, no. And you think, well, big surprise. They're not doing well. And I think it's something that students often try to answer questions or try to respond to material in a textbook without actually ever having read it. So I would suggest that the first hint of how to improve study skills with reading is to actually attempt to read it. Now, I know you can give us advice on specifically how to improve reading skills. What are some of the things that you would suggest?
Well, Christy, I think that it's not too surprising that students do find that they have a problem with reading textbooks. We all have different attitudes towards the amount of reading material that we incorporate into any given course. And one of the first strategies that a student needs to develop is to learn that they need to have a flexible approach to reading, that for any given reading task there may be different strategies to do that effectively and efficiently.
So do you mean like for a literature class where perhaps a student is reading a novel or a short story, that they would actually have a different reading style than if they were reading a world history textbook or a psychology textbook?
Exactly, and a different style than the one they would use to read the newspaper. So the first thing is to know exactly what your reading requirement is and to assess that realistically. And the second thing is to know the book that you're dealing with. And there are several strategies that I could show you and demonstrate that are ways in which you can analyze what is in the book. The most important thing, I think, for a student or anyone that wants to be a good reader is to be an aggressive reader. And by that I mean predetermine what it is that you're going to do with this material, what you need to have to take away from this particular reading requirement, and have that a good plan mapped out as to how you're going to do that. So the first thing is be an aggressive reader. And the second thing I would say is to always demand sense. When I was teaching in the reading lab as a reading specialist, one of the things that I really noticed about poor readers is that they often don't expect to get sense. And if it seems contradictory, they just throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I just don't understand it. And I'd say, second, demand sense out of what you read. If you find that there's a contradiction, ask your teacher, ask one of your study friends, but don't let yourself get in the habit of saying to yourself, having a passive feeling about it, it doesn't make sense, it's hopeless.
Sometimes even just going back and rereading it and looking for a subject and a verb sometimes makes it clear the second time.
Exactly.
If you go back through it and try it again.
Exactly, and I'm going to show you a reading strategy that developed out of one that used to be called the SQ3R, but it's one in which you do a pre-survey of the material by reading each topic sentence, the introduction and the summary at the end of a section, and by that you already set up your expectations of what you think you should get. So often people, when they're reading, kind of feel like it's like backing into a forest, you know, they're just sort of passively trying to let the material pull them through instead of setting up their own expectations and their own requirements. And you can establish a habit of surveying a book and doing that in an orderly way to improve the options and the opportunities that you have to extract sense from it.
Okay.
That's, and then I think another thing that is hand in hand with this developing good reading habits is to always be in a situation in which you can make the most of your reading time. That's partly involving the place, you know yourself and know which place is the best for you, where you read most efficiently. It may be in your own room. It may be at a table in a library where there are people around you, but not necessarily talking to you, if you kind of like to feel that human presence around you. Don't try to fool yourself into thinking that you read best lying in bed when you know that you're going to go to sleep the next minute in 5 minutes. So know your place, your best space. Don't get in the habit of thinking that you can read while watching television. You cannot be an aggressive reader and put the kinds of demands on your attention when you only are paying half attention and watching a television show at the same time. It's just impossible.
And that's true of all forms of studying. It's your brain can only be divided so many ways.
Right.
And when you need that intense concentration so that you do remember the material that you're reading, when you're trying to divide it between the phone, what you're doing, and maybe the radio or stereo or TV, it just is too much for it.
You probably really save yourself social time if you just go ahead and pay attention to the reading or the studying that you're doing and really concentrate your time there and effectively deal with it, and then leave it and go have your social time and enjoy your friends.
Okay. You wanted to also tell us about assessing our purposes in reading.
Yes, that's true. A textbook in history is going to make different demands on your style of reading, your approach to it, than, say, a textbook in accounting or one on chemistry. And any of those will certainly be different from a novel, which will, if it's a good novelist, will probably pull you right into the story and sweep you along with it. That's also a very different reading style from, say, reading the newspapers in the morning. People always want to know about speed reading. And there are stories of legendary readers like John F. Kennedy, they said, who could read 2,800 words a minute. He had so much knowledge that he would bring to any newspaper of what was going on in the world. He probably scanned it very quickly at perhaps a rate of 2,800 words a minute. But he had so much prior information already that he didn't need to look for very much of a match for new things coming in through that newspaper source. And that's another thing that I'm going to talk about is stimulating your own memory to bring your previous knowledge into your reading chore so that you can establish a kind of a, it's called in learning research schemata. You can set up your own structure with what you have previously known about this subject. That gives you an additional boost that you'll probably remember it, that you'll probably understand it.
Now, you had mentioned earlier the SQ3R method that's no longer used quite as rigidly as I think it was taught some years ago. And now it's called the 2SQR. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Christy, I kind of made that up because
that's yours.
Yes, that's mine. It is kind of an evolved method from that, but it's based on what I have seen in the classroom, what I think works, as well as from some new learning theory. And the SQ3R used to be, S was survey the material, Q was make up some questions for what you expect to find out, what you think you will be able to answer, and the 3 R's were read, recite, and review. In some places they call that the SQ2R. It's kind of difficult to tell what is the difference between recite and review, and I think people could see that. That probably came from old learning theory that if you repeat something 3 times, you probably learn it. That's probably why they had the 3 R's in there. in working with students and reading some of the contemporary research, I think that it's a little easier to explain it as a 2SQR, because I think there is a little bit difference in the approach, the survey that you do to scope it out, and a second survey that you can do to scan the material to establish what you really are going to try to find out in this reading. Would you like to see?
Sure.
Okay. I have put on the overhead these instructions. The first step is to survey the material. Scope it out. I tell students they should read titles, subtitles, marginal notes, pictures, picture captions, and concentrate, first of all, on one section, say 3 to 5 pages at a time. Pick a section which makes sense, that seems to have an organized idea from the beginning to the end, but start with a small section. You know, divide and conquer and set yourself a small chore to begin to develop these concentration habits, your concentration muscles. So look at this, and for instance, in the section that we have here, this is from a Western civ book that we use here in Western civilization. And you can see this is, chapter 4 is the medieval world, Western Europe. And in this section, it's introduced with this picture of, it looks like a knight, a medieval knight on a horse, and there's some bodies there. There's a war or tournament or something going on there. And if you read just the medieval world, Western Europe, and you notice those pictures, the society and its economy, the turning point of the 11th century. This picture, Draper's Hall, Ghent, begun in the 15th century. It's a very elaborate, beautiful Gothic building, and now, as this indicates, they're talking 15th century. And then if you went down here to whatever marginal notes or titles and captions, town and countryside, and we're going to set this first section right here. We're going to stop at monarchy in the medieval West. So just from that, I would tell students, what do you think? Search your own memory. You saw a picture of a knight. You know, it's the medieval period, the Middle Ages in the West. You saw something about the 11th century and the turning point. I imagine most students would come to that section and say, oh, the Middle Ages. I bet this is going to be about knights and the Crusades. And I remember in the 8th grade, I wonder if it's going to be about castles and how they built castles, and about romantic things like that. And that's probably where a person might take off from, scanning their own memory to set up some expectations. Now, as a matter of fact, this section does not, as you can see from the titles and the subtitles, deal with that part of the Middle Ages. It is about the economy. So having established some expectations from your own memory, setting that up, the second kind of a survey is to go back and actually read each introductory section or paragraph, each first sentence, which is a topic sentence in a paragraph, and any summary paragraph following a section. And from that, you would actually set up some expectations and some actual questions of what this content will tell you. Now, we'll go back and do this kind of a survey, which is really a scanning process. Now, with this, the medieval world, Western Europe, at this point, I'm going to use my highlighter, but you would be reading this part.
So they would need to read the entire introduction.
This introduction, usually a chapter will have an introduction. This is the beginning of a chapter, so it has an introductory section, and you'll note when we go on to the next page, and notice the society and its economy, the turning point in the 11th century. The 11th century proved to be a major turning point in the social and economic life in the West, although nobody alive at the time could have been fully conscious of what was happening. As the raids of the Northmen tapered off, most of Western Europe found itself secure. Then go down and read each first sentence, which is usually the topic of the paragraph. Some books, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, know the book. Some writers may use the first sentence as kind of a catch your attention and then put the topic in the second sentence. You just get to know the style of the writer of the textbook that you're dealing with. So the larger population needed more food and more land. Technology helped to improve the farmer's life. Trade in town. During the 11th century, trade began also slowly to revive. When the proprietor of a manor found that he could regularly make large sums by selling a certain crop, he would plant more and more of that crop and use the money. The recovery of commerce and the beginning of industry stimulated the growth of towns. Townsmen would band together into guilds to protect themselves from brigands on the roads and to bargain with the lord of the next castle. He might be confiscating, charging them high tolls. Mutual advantage soon led proprietors, including kings and lesser lords, to grant privileges to the townsmen by issuing a charter. So this is the way in which you would proceed with this particular content. And I'm going to give you a pretest here as soon as we finish this chore. Industry followed commerce into the town. Enterprise was neither free nor private. Town and countryside. The towns greatly affected the overwhelming mass of the population who remained in the countryside, who now had a place to sell their surplus, and so an incentive to produce it. With the increase in demand for goods, large-scale fairs became common. And the final part of this section we'll just read the last sentence here, the last part. Acceptance of these bills of exchange, a kind of primitive check, often made it unnecessary to transport money at all. Okay, are you ready for a pretest?
Oh, I hope so.
Let's see what we've gotten out of that survey and how much you can deal with here. Number one, the turning point in the development of settled medieval culture was in the 9th century. True or false?
That's false.
Okay. The Crusades began in the 13th century. And if you don't feel like you gained that information, just say, can't tell.
Okay, can't tell.
Okay.
This is so embarrassing on TV, too.
I didn't tell
I
you
was
that
hoping that I remembered what you were saying.
Oh. The population of Europe increased because of the migration of barbarian tribes in the 6th century.
I can't tell.
Okay, we'll say can't tell. You know, Chrissy, what we're doing, what I'm doing to you, and I didn't tell you that we were going to, is really a good case in point that part of what will activate your memory and your alertness when you read is to have a question in mind that you don't know the answer. So I kind of tricked you into this because if you have set yourself some questions that you're going to read to find out, you're reading for a purpose. That's a key to reading comprehension. So the ones that you didn't get enough information in the survey, that's part of this reading strategy, is to set you up with a question that you must answer in your reading.
Oh, good.
It helps your attention.
Good.
Farm production remained low in Europe until the inventions of the 15th century.
True.
Population in Europe increased in the 11th century.
I can't tell.
Okay.
I don't remember a single date except the 15th
I know.
century.
I'm like that too. I have to make a special effort to do dates. The commercial centers of Venice and the Low Countries never disappeared even in the Dark Ages.
I don't remember.
Can't tell. I don't think it was answered. All trade was through bartering or trading in the Middle Ages. There was no form of money.
That's false.
Townsmen created guilds to protect themselves from thieves and to set up bargaining.
True.
Craft guilds provided medical care and burial for members.
I can't tell.
Can't tell.
It sounds good.
Okay, we'll put true there. Serfs were punished and returned if found in the towns.
I don't remember.
Okay.
Did you say that?
No, it wasn't.
Good.
It wasn't in the material.
Good.
So I think what you have here now, that you've done this pretest, which I made up, is that you've set yourself up for some questions to answer.
I definitely have.
And when you start reading this material again, you'll find that these are answered. Indeed, you will find the answers to them. And this is one of the secrets of becoming a good reader, is that when you're doing your survey, set yourself up some questions to answer. If we were doing that survey, the questions that could have come up from just the material that we scanned would have been things like this. When was the turning point in the revival of settled and secure culture? And that was in the title. It was in a subheading, the 11th century. It was in a first sentence also in a paragraph. What were some conditions or events that caused it? And these were pretty much just going straight down, taking the topic sentence out of those paragraphs as we continued to survey it. Tapering off of the Norse raids, the Crusades, growth of population, growth of farmland, technological inventions, and then why did trade in towns begin to grow? And you would have found from the survey they had more products and produce to sell. Trade fairs stimulated town settlements, revival of old Roman towns, creation of guilds for protection, charters were issued, they were privileges to towns. Industry followed commerce. Enterprise neither free nor private. The growth of cash. Some serfs could buy freedom and escape to the towns. Bills of exchange were a kind of a primitive check. Now, this is information that we would get just from doing the kind of survey which I just demonstrated. When you're in college, professors usually do not give you a list of 100 questions for you to find in the reading material. That's an aid which we do in high school because that's the level of introducing material. But when you're in college, you need to be able to generate the questions yourself. And that's why this SQ or 2SQR method is one that you can take with you into higher, more demanding reading requirements in college. One further thing that you may have overlooked in doing this, you notice that I divided this into a section which had a beginning and an end, and it was only 3 pages with another paragraph on the fourth. Start with a small section to develop this habit and this style of reading when you're dealing with textbooks like this. Learn how to set up your own expectations. Learn how to draw from your memory a schemata, which is a new term for that, the memory and what you already bring into it from your prior knowledge. And learn to be an aggressive reader, be on top of it, be ahead of your reading. Don't be passive. Don't let it drag you around. When you find that your attention is flagging, stop, close your eyes, stand up, walk around, splash water in your face, but don't get into the habit of letting yourself be a passive reader. Always demand information.
Now, one of the things that we had talked about earlier is that at this point, most of the students that are watching this show are in public high school, and they cannot make marks in the textbook. But at the college level, when you own your own textbook and you can highlight, make notes in the side margins, underline, that's a very effective tool also to make those marks. While you're in high school, you might need to take notes. Keep a notebook beside you and make notes, and that's very effective for also being a non-passive reader.
True.
The more involved you personally are with it, the better you will understand it and retain it.
Exactly. Sometimes I ask my classes, when we go through and demonstrate this kind of survey approach to reading, then I usually ask them, because so many of my students really are good readers, they're aggressive readers, and I'll ask them what are some of their own strategies that they find useful. And a good portion of them will say that they like to use highlighters, that's an important strategy when they're allowed to do that. Marking in the margins, I think, is also a good strategy, which helps you interact with the text, and sometimes you may want to put question marks there, or sometimes I used to put IMP with exclamation points, important, writing into it that there's a contradiction here that contradicts Professor Smith. Those kinds of things also set up the kind of attention alert systems. And reading with a purpose in mind is the most important thing.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us, and I know that our listeners have picked up some valuable information about how to read more effectively.
I hope so, and I've enjoyed being here with you also. Thank you very much.
We're here today continuing our series on study skills for free advice, and we're with Dr. Ruth Loeffler, who is a teacher at Norman High School. She teaches Western Civilization as well as Advanced English. She is our gifted and talented director for this school, and she's also very active in the Arts and Humanities Council of Norman. And she's here today to talk to us about reading and how to become a better reader. Ruth, start us off. Tell us about what strategies or techniques are best for students to use when trying to read textbooks.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to emphasize the fact that there isn't just one strategy for reading that works for everything. There are different strategies and different approaches to reading, and a person should be flexible and have a number of different styles depending upon what the reading requirements are in this particular job. So you'd have a different reading strategy for reading a newspaper and a different one for reading a novel, and you would probably apply a different set of expectations to reading a textbook. The particular strategy that I was going to demonstrate this morning is one that is a variation of SQ3R, which was quite popular about 15 years ago. I have used that and helped students to develop a strategy for understanding a textbook, particularly in the area of history, Western Civilization, Introduction to American Lit, that will help them set up their expectations and be aggressive and in advance of the reading. Sometimes, you know, you get into reading and your attention flags and you just you've read something, you've gone through 3 or 4 pages and you've forgotten what the first page was about.
Right.
Has that ever happened?
Oh.
I think I hear people
all the
say
time.
all the time.
All the time.
And so one of the tricks to that is to set up your expectations in advance, and the system that I'm going to show you this morning is one in which it's, as I said, a variation of SQ3R. I'm calling it 2SQR, and that stands for scope out the material, scan the material by surveying it, make up some questions that you expect to answer, and read the material and find out the answers to those questions which you have asked.
Now, in the question part of that, oftentimes teachers give students a list of questions, and if they would just maybe read through those questions, they would have an idea of what questions to look for
True.
in the text.
This is true, and college professors will not give you
Right.
those questions. So you have to have a way in which you can do that for yourself. And this system is one in which you can set up your own questions by making informed surveys and establishing in your own mind, drawing upon your own prior knowledge, what you can expect to find out from this reading task.
Okay, would you show us, Ruth, how that could be applied to a textbook?
Yes, I have. We have put a passage from Civilization in the West. It's chapter 5, which deals with the medieval world. And I'm going to put this on and show you the way in which you would, first of all, survey it by reading all of the titles, subtitles, any marginal notes, pictures. A lot of people sometimes don't notice that pictures really have information, and they really do, as well as the introductory paragraph and any summary paragraphs. And so I'll put the text on right now so that our audience can see in what manner you would do this. And hope the cameras go off of me, so I'm going to put my shoe back on.
Okay.
Now, in this book, you can see the picture is going to emphasize the knight on the horse, and there's a body, so evidently it has something to do with war, crusades, tournaments. And the introduction deals with the medieval world beginning about the year 1000. And I will just let the audience read along here with this material, which is highlighted.
So what it looks like is that we are paying particular attention to the introduction, and then we are looking at topic sentences and titles and headings.
True. And at this point, as you have scoped this out, go back in your own memory and try to retrieve anything that you already know. Most of the students that have come up to this level know something about the Middle Ages because they probably studied it in the 8th grade. They probably studied things about knights and castles and crusades, and that information will be helpful as far as placing it in a context of a time and a place. The material in this particular section is going to be much more advanced in terms of economy, which is what this is all about. After you have gotten a set from your own expectations and scoped it out, continue your survey by scanning it. And when you scan, you're going to read every beginning paragraph or introduction, again the topics, titles, subtitles, and any marginal notes. Read every beginning sentence of each paragraph until you get to a final summary and read that in its entirety. Now, if you did that with this material, you would be able to come out with some questions that would look about like this. And this is the third part of this. After you're scoping it out, scanning it, you should be able to make up these questions based upon this first scanning survey. When was the turning point in the revival of settled and secure culture? What were some conditions or events that caused it? And these were all out of those first sentences: tapering off of Norse raids, the Crusades, growth of population, growth of farmland, technological inventions. Why did trading towns begin to grow? More products, produce to sell. Trade fairs stimulated town settlements. Revival of old Roman towns. Creation of guilds, protection. Charters were issued, privileges to towns. Industry followed commerce. Enterprise was neither free nor private. Growth of cash. Some serfs could buy freedom and escape to towns, and that there began to be in use a bill of exchange, which was a kind of primitive check. This is all information that you could have gained by doing this sort of scanning, and you could ask yourself these questions. Now, your reading time is not, now you are ready to read. And when you go back and read this material, you'll find all of this neatly fitting into your expectations or the apparatus, the scheme, or the schemata which you've set up for yourself. So it's much more likely that your attention will be on your reading and that you will come out remembering some of the things that you have read. If it's a kind of a reading assignment where you really have to read the chapter and take a test on it cold, on your own, as you often do in university courses, then you probably want to go back and review this material again.
Okay, now this is an excellent strategy for reading. I know that there are also some hints about reading that can make people better readers.
Yes, I think that inherent in any kind of a plan or structure like this is the first characteristic, or the first tip, is be an aggressive reader. Predetermine what you need to take from this reading task. Decide ahead of time what the material is like and know what you need to learn from it. Be aggressive, expect it to make sense. Don't let it, don't just be satisfied with contradictions that you seem to find in it. Ask questions of a teacher or of some of your friends that you studied with. Demand that it makes sense.
And if it doesn't, we should say go back and read it again.
And go back and read it again, right. Sometimes when you talk through it with a friend or ask questions of your teacher too, this not only allows you to find out what was the contradiction, but it also lets your teacher know that you really want to get this information. And one of the things that I think is really important to emphasize is that you not allow yourself to be a passive reader. A lot of times people think that they can read. I have students tell me, I read best while I'm watching television. You cannot be this kind of concentrated, aggressive reader if you're not paying attention to it and leading yourself into it. You can be a passive reader, but then you've wasted the time. You have to go back and read it because your attention flagged away from it. So you didn't really get the job done. And another thing that is important is that you know yourself, and that you know the material, you know the chore, you know yourself, you know where you can best concentrate. It may be in your own room. It may be at a table in a library where you can feel the presence of other people around you, but you need to be realistic and know yourself and your own reading habits, as well as the requirements for the course from your professor and from the book.
Okay, so basically what you're telling us is that we need to know, again, it goes back to our own study style.
Exactly.
How we best can learn. And so we have to be always aware of what are the best conditions for ourselves in order to be the most productive student. And in that we have to be sure to do our 2 SQR and to actually read the assignments. I know that a lot of times students think that they can pass classes without ever opening the textbook, or by just getting the teacher's questions and looking for those in the text material. But generally that's not the best way to really be a successful student. Your method seems to work a lot better for.
Well, some students might use this as a starting point and then spin off their own style off of this. Again, the important things are to know the material, know yourself, as you said, your own study styles.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. I know that if our students are paying attention, they'll be better readers by next week.
I
Thank
hope so.
you.
Thank you for having me.